Before the world watched him silence doubters at UFC 323, Petr Yan walked through poverty, street fights, humiliation, and the brutal politics of MMA. His rise was violent, his fall was public, and his comeback? No one believed it until the night he stunned Merab Dvalishvili and rewrote his own legacy in real time. There was a time when Petr Yan walked into the octagon like a man entering his office, calm, cold, calculated, expecting to leave with your pride in a plastic bag. He wasn't just a champion, he was efficiency wrapped in violence. Analysts called him the cleanest boxer in MMA, the most technical bantamweight alive, the future of the division. And yet, in the years leading into UFC 323, those same analysts began describing him with words he'd spent his career proving wrong. Unfocused, emotional, broken, slipping. It didn't happen overnight. It happened in fragments. An illegal knee that became a meme. A rematch where he looked human. A losing streak that turned whispers into declarations. The sport he once ruled now treated him like a cautionary tale. Fans mocked him. Fighters targeted him. Even the UFC slowly shifted the spotlight toward new faces, new contenders, men with less mileage and less baggage. And buried beneath the criticism was the loss that stung the deepest. Merab Dvalishvili smothering him for 25 relentless minutes. The cardio machine turned Yan into a statue. It wasn't just a defeat, it was public humiliation. People said Merab stole his will, stole his aura, stole the version of Petr Yan the world feared. After that night, Yan vanished. No interviews, no excuses, no public meltdowns, just silence. A silence heavy enough that fans assumed the worst. Retirement, decline, maybe even that he simply didn't care anymore. But silence is dangerous, because silence is where pressure cooks. Silence is where broken champions rebuild themselves in ways no one sees coming. And long before the world witnessed UFC 323, something within Petr Yan had already begun to shift. Because a man with nothing left to lose becomes the man everyone should fear. Long before belts, bright lights, and global scrutiny, Petr Yan was just another kid in Dudinka, a Siberian town where the cold doesn't ask for permission, it attacks. Winters there weren't just seasons, they were tests. Streets were quiet, factories loud, and childhood was less about innocence and more about survival. If you grew up soft, you didn't grow up for long. The first time Yan walked into a boxing gym, it wasn't some cinematic revelation, it was necessity. His older brother dragged him in, hoping to toughen him up, maybe keep him out of trouble, maybe steer him away from the dangerous distractions that swallow young men whole. But the gym didn't toughen him, it awakened him. Under flickering lights, with cracked gloves held together by tape and coaches who barked instead of taught, Petr discovered a rhythm that felt like home. Precision, timing, discipline, the kind of structure that could turn chaos into order. But life outside the ring wasn't structured. Fights in schoolyards, long days, long nights, empty pockets, and a future that seemed as frozen as the streets he walked. Siberia didn't build dreams, it crushed them. So when Petr decided he wasn't going to become another nameless statistic, it wasn't rebellion, it wasn't ambition, it was survival instinct firing for the first time. He learned early that pain was information, pressure was opportunity, and anger, if controlled, could be a weapon sharper than any right hook. Those lessons would follow him into every gym, every fight. Every moment he sought to carve his name into something bigger than Dudinka. But leaving home wouldn't make things easier, because the world outside Siberia didn't care how tough you were. It only cared if you could prove it. Before the UFC recognized Petr Yan, before Russia embraced him, before fans ever argued over his legacy, Yan worked the kind of jobs that break backs and drain souls. Factory shifts, construction sites, heavy lifting for small pay, manual labor that leaves you too exhausted to dream. Yet somehow, after days spent moving steel and lumber, he dragged himself to crowded gyms where fighters trained for regional bouts that nobody watched and even fewer got paid for. There was no spotlight, no sponsors, no guaranteed future, just grit, just repetition, just a young man trying to fight his way out of obscurity, one bruised knuckle at a time. Russian regional MMA wasn't glamorous. It was brutal, inconsistent, often corrupt. Fighters took matches on days' notice. Paychecks showed up late, if at all. Many quit, many broke. Yan didn't. He was too stubborn, too focused, too unwilling to let the world decide his fate. Coaches noticed. Opponents noticed. A pattern began to form. You could hurt Peter. You could frustrate him. You could push him into deep water, but you could not make him back down. As he evolved, something else clicked. Precision replaced brawling. Strategy replaced emotion. He began piecing together the style that would later terrify UFC bantamweights. Razor-sharp boxing, footwork like a matador, defense wrapped in aggression. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was solving them. And then, finally, the call came. The UFC wanted him, not as a prodigy, not as a star in the making, but as a test. A grinder from Siberia who would probably wash out. A new name to feed to hungry prospects. They didn't realize they had just opened the door for a man who'd spent his entire life breaking through walls. And the moment Petr Yan stepped into the octagon, the division would never be the same again. When Petr Yan began tearing through Russia's regional MMA scene, it wasn't with the arrogance of a prodigy or the swagger of a chosen one. It was with the discipline of someone who had already spent a lifetime mastering hardship. He wasn't the fighter who relied on a single weapon. He was the fighter who built his identity on layers. Footwork sharpened by boxing, kicks born from taekwondo, clinch control from Muay Thai, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone dictate the pace. In Russia, word spread fast. Petr Yan wasn't just winning, he was dissecting. Every opponent felt the same cold process. First the pressure, then the feints, then the shots that landed like punctuation marks. He didn't overwhelm through chaos, he overwhelmed through correctness, efficiency, a style so clean it felt cruel. When he won, he barely celebrated. When he lost, he studied, sharpened, and came back twice as dangerous. His run through ACB became a highlight reel of precision violence. Analysts started whispering he might be the best bantamweight prospect outside the UFC. Fighters began avoiding him. Promoters leaned on him to carry events. And through it all, Yan remained indifferent. He didn't crave fame, he craved progress. So when the UFC finally called, they didn't roll out a red carpet. They handed him a contract filled with doubt, low pay, high expectations. A slot beneath fighters the company viewed as future stars. To them, he was a test, a tough out, a dog from Siberia who might break if they threw enough adversity his way. But when Yan walked into the UFC for the first time, he did so with the same look he carried since Dudinka, a calm fury, a quiet confidence, an understanding that every room he entered would eventually belong to him. He began slicing through the roster, fight after fight. Peter showed that his Russian rise wasn't luck or regional inflation. It was foundation. His striking looked too sharp for the division, his pacing too measured, his defense too composed. Suddenly, the UFC found themselves with a contender they hadn't planned for. No Mercy wasn't just a nickname, it was a manifesto. But every rise contains its flaw, and Yan's flaw would become painfully clear the moment he reached the top. Because the higher you climb in the UFC, the more catastrophic a single mistake becomes. Petr Yan's climb to the UFC bantamweight title felt inevitable, like gravity in reverse. Once he built momentum, no one could stop him. His style was too efficient, too suffocating, too calibrated to the chaos of MMA. When he finally fought for gold, he didn't walk into the spotlight nervous or overwhelmed. He walked in like a man clocking into work. And by the end of that night, he wasn't just a champion. He was a problem the entire division would have to solve. He neutralized elites with a surgeon's patience. His jabs landed like spears. His combinations flowed like language. Fight IQ commentators usually reserved for legends was suddenly being attributed to a man from Dudinka who fought like a perfect hybrid of technique and cruelty. Fans began calling him the cleanest boxer in the UFC. Media crowned him the future of the division, and even the skeptics couldn't deny it. Yan wasn't winning by accident. He was winning by design. But inside, the brilliance was a warning. Yan fought with an intensity that bordered on emotional. He didn't just want to beat opponents. He wanted to make them regret thinking they could. It made him electrifying. It made him feared, but that same fire, that same edge, that same refusal to yield, that was the same thing that eventually led to his collapse. The illegal knee against Aljamain Sterling wasn't just a foul, it was a fracture in his mythology. 1 second, he stood inches from a dominant title defense. The next, he became the face of one of the most infamous mistakes in UFC history. Overnight, he turned from untouchable champion into a punchline. Memes, mockery. He threw the belt away, they said. He's too emotional, others claimed. The world that praised his aggression now used it as a weapon against him. The rematch brought more pain. A narrow loss that some argued he won, but most agreed he didn't seize. Suddenly, he wasn't the future. He was a question mark. And when Merab later drowned him with cardio, fans declared the Emperor stripped of everything that once made him terrifying. The dominance that built him was gone. The doubts that haunted him were louder than ever. And for the first time in his career, Petr Yan found himself staring at a future he didn't recognize. After the Merab fight, the decline of Petr Yan didn't feel like a losing streak. It felt like a public unraveling. The fighter who once carried himself like a chess grandmaster suddenly looked human, reactive, almost uncertain. For a man whose identity was built on precision and control, this was the cruelest twist. MMA fans are unforgiving, and they turned on him with a speed that only the internet can deliver. One moment, he was the most feared striker in the bantamweight division. The next, he was washed, figured out, done. Every loss seemed to rewrite his legacy. Every criticism grew sharper. Analysts claimed he wasn't evolving. Fighters began calling him out, sensing weakness, not in his skills, but in his confidence. The man once known for his icy composure now faced a storm of narratives trying to define him. And for the first time, it felt like the sport he once dominated was pushing him toward the exit. What made it worse was the noise surrounding him. Fans accused him of being a dirty fighter after the illegal knee. Others blamed him for Sterling's injury narratives. Media outlets painted him as hot-headed, emotional, self-destructive. It didn't matter if these were exaggerations. The damage had been done. Yan wasn't just losing fights. He was losing the benefit of doubt. He was becoming the villain of a story he never wanted to be in. And then he disappeared. No interviews, no call-outs, no justifications, just silence. A silence thick enough that even his harshest critics wondered what he was doing. Some assumed he was done. Others assumed he had nothing left to say. But the truth was far more dangerous. Petr Yan wasn't hiding. He was rebuilding. While the world mocked him, he rewired himself. He switched training environments, trimmed his circle, studied tape not as a fighter desperate for a win, but as a man trying to understand where he went wrong and how to never go wrong again. His teammates later whispered about that period that he trained differently, calmly, analytically, that he stopped fighting to prove people wrong and started fighting to prove himself right. The silence wasn't surrender. It was incubation. And when the rematch with Merab finally came at UFC 323, the world had no idea that the version of Petr Yan stepping into that cage was not the broken man they remembered. He was the man they feared he might become again. The man built by fire. The man shaped by anger. The man who had finally rediscovered his own ruthlessness. When Petr Yan vanished from the spotlight, most assumed he was running from the truth, that the sport had caught up to him, that Merab had broken him, that he was quietly accepting the end of his prime. But Yan's disappearance wasn't surrender. It was metamorphosis. Behind closed doors, far removed from social media, pundits, and critics, he began the most important fight of his career, a fight not against an opponent, but against the version of himself that had failed. This wasn't a typical training camp. It wasn't even a reinvention. It was a dismantling. Yan stripped his fighting identity down to its bones, examining everything he'd once done instinctively. His footwork patterns, his defensive entries, his tendency to build slow and surge late, his habit of letting emotion blur the edges of strategy. Nothing was safe from scrutiny. The former champion approached his own flaws like a surgeon, cutting, refining, stitching, rebuilding. He changed training partners. He sought out new wrestling minds. He added marathon conditioning drills that left even elite athletes staring in disbelief. He didn't talk. He didn't gloat. He didn't camp hop for attention. He built a bunker and worked inside it. His sparring partners described him as quiet, calculating, different. The icy calm that once defined him had returned, but this time, it wasn't youthful confidence. It was hardened purpose. And while he trained, the world moved on. Merab defended belts. Contenders rose and fell. Social media forgot his name. The UFC stopped marketing him. Fans debated whether he should retire. But this irrelevance became fuel. Petr Yan had been many things in his career: a villain, a champion, a technician, a cautionary tale. Now he embraced a new identity: the unseen threat. Every fighter who rises must eventually reinvent themselves or die out, but few accomplish that reinvention in darkness. Yan was building something dangerous in that darkness, a version of himself unburdened by pressure, untouched by noise, sharpened by humiliation. And when the UFC finally offered him the rematch with Merab Dvalishvili, it wasn't an opportunity. It was an ignition point. The world thought they were watching a broken man march toward another beating. They weren't. They were watching a weapon that had been hidden too long, finally being unsheathed. When UFC 323 was announced, the reaction was unanimous. Petr Yan was being fed to the machine again. Fans laughed. Commentators questioned the matchmaking. Every analyst picked Merab, the cardio monster, the relentless grinder, the man whose pressure had turned Yan into a statue the first time. Headlines weren't about the fight. They were about Yan's presumed demise. And Yan embraced every word, because a fighter with zero expectations carries zero fear. Fight week was surreal. Merab bounced through media obligations with trademark energy. Yan, in contrast, was a statue. Silent, unbothered, unreadable, no trash talk, no emotion. Just the cold stare of a man who had lived in the shadows long enough to understand how powerful invisibility can be. When the two finally faced off, Merab smiled wide, confident. Yan didn't blink. When the cage door closed, the world waited for Merab's storm. But what came instead was the shock no one predicted. Yan met pressure with angles, counters, defense. He didn't retreat. He redirected. He didn't freeze. He flowed. Every attempt to drown him turned into an opening. Every entry Merab tried brought a fist waiting on the other side. And then came the moment, the punch, the shift, the unraveling of an assumption the entire MMA world had embraced as gospel. And the impossible became real. Petr Yan had stopped the unstoppable. A fighter most had left for dead resurrected himself in a single heartbeat. Years of mockery evaporated. Doubt disintegrated. Yan stood in the center of the octagon, fists raised, eyes cold, not joyful, not triumphant, but vindicated. Because this wasn't just a victory, it was reclamation. It was a man ripping his name back from a sport that had tried to erase him. And as the crowd roared, one truth lingered. No mercy had returned. After UFC 323, the MMA world scrambled to rewrite the narrative they had spent years crafting. Suddenly, the man labeled washed, emotional, finished, had resurrected himself with the most shocking win of his career. Headlines shifted overnight. Analysts who once dismissed him now praised his discipline, his adjustments, his composure. Fans who mocked him began reciting excuses for why they ever doubted him. But none of that mattered to Petr Yan. He hadn't fought for headlines. He fought for self-correction. He fought for pride. He fought to reclaim the identity the sport tried to strip from him. The win didn't just revive his career. It warped the entire bantamweight landscape. If Merab could be defeated, who else could? If Yan was truly back, who was safe? Opponents who once called him out for clout now went quiet. Contenders began reevaluating their paths. Champions felt a pressure that hadn't existed in years. Because this wasn't simply a comeback, it was a warning. And for Yan, the silence that once haunted him transformed into something new: clarity. For the first time since his championship run, he wasn't weighed down by emotion. He wasn't carrying the burden of narratives, controversies, or expectations. He was simply fighting again, strategically, brutally, beautifully. The sport that once mocked him now feared him. But Yan's victory at UFC 323 wasn't just about tactical evolution. It was about psychological reclamation. He proved that the illegal knee didn't define him. The losing streak didn't crush him. The Merab pressure cooker didn't break him. He proved something far more dangerous, that he could adapt, rebuild, return, and win against the one man the world believed would retire him. Yet beneath the triumph, a lingering question grew louder. What comes after redemption? Yan had taken back his identity, silenced his critics, and shocked the division. But now the world wanted to know if this version of No Mercy was a one-night resurrection or the beginning of another reign. Because if the man who beat Merab Dvalishvili at UFC 323 remains this sharp, this cold, this precise, the entire bantamweight division may be entering its most dangerous era yet.